industry had, and that it was obvious to you that the industry, in regards to the textile code, had extended their power into the textile code. It was obvious to you from the beginning. Could you say that very clearly? That I had asked you before, were you surprised or frustrated? And you said you weren't frustrated. It was that you knew about it from the beginning. Could you just could you make that clear for me?
Well, we were people in unions in the United States when trying to advance unionization realize that the employers in this country are deeply set against organization of workers and resisted and develop all kinds of techniques for preventing it or demolishing this effort. They hire many different experts in the field of communication, law, economics, and seek thereby to frustrate any such effort, and obviously apply all kinds of pressures on their employees to discourage them and prevent them from being interested or believing in unionism, to the point where they frequently discharge people so they don't have to make any such judgment. And this has continued into the present day. You ask any employer, or most employers, and if they had a choice, would they rather have a union or not have a union in their plant? And they will express it very explicitly. They don't want a union in their plant. It abridges their power and their authority and their rights of management. And they evidence it in many, many ways.
Now, but back in between 33 and the time of the strike, okay, like you said, you weren't. It wasn't surprising to you that the industry had as much power as they did when it came to the textile code, because they constructed it. So if you could simply tell me, from your perspective, that you knew that it was obvious from the beginning that they wielded this power over the cotton textile code, and that they weren't really going to give an inch to the workers, even though the code itself looked like it was there.
We were all hoping that the government might be more persuasive and apply enough power to force them to shed and to set aside their prejudices and their unwillingness to accept unionization of workers. We depended on two forces. One, as I said, government, and secondly, the organization of workers, and a common word in unionism is solidarity. The unity among workers in enforcing their power, or as the Wagner Act said, become a count.
We're gonna have to say?
Yeah.
Okay. So saying it was obvious to us from the beginning that the industry was going to be able to control the textile code and certainly not recognize the rights of workers. And so we could only hope that through public pressure and worker pressure that the government would turn around and say to industry, look, you're going to have to do it like this. That's what you were saying, and I imagine it leads up to the strike.
Well, basically, when you organize a union in the United States, you assume that the employer is not going to be friendly to your efforts. And therefore, I've known many people in polite society who are employers, who are generally very liberal, but when it relates to their own managerial rights, are reluctant to share it with the workers' union, and therefore will use every tool at their command, even and some even to the extent of violating the law, in order to prevent such union organization.
Now, how does that apply to 34?
Well, the Southern employers were all unanimous, practically, with the idea that they should resist unions. I'll give you a good measure of it. When Sidney Hillman was chosen as director of the organizing committee for the Textile Union in 37, one of the first appointments he made was to appoint a Southern Unionist as its director for the South. This man was head of the Printers Union, Typographical Union. He was well recognized as a public citizen, as a moderate man, as a stable unionist, and he had many contacts in employers' circles to whom he could reach, and who might be able to dispel the ogre-like images which are generated about unions. This man was appointed Southern Director in part because of these qualities, and it was hoped that he would persuade the industrial leadership of the South to change their attitudes and to accept the law. Unfortunately, he died before the end of 1937. But during his lifetime, from April to December 37, he won more than 50 elections and hardly got any employer in the South to negotiate an agreement.
Now, in 34, could you tell us how that power, employer power, demonstrated itself?
In various ways. First, if we organized a plant, they refused to negotiate a contract, and we lost many opportunities for establishing collective bargaining because the employers wouldn't agree to an agreement. And there was nothing in the agreements which we offered them which was untoward and raised any real issues of policy. Secondly, the employers combined and developed uniform policies among themselves to resist unions. One of the interesting episodes in the history of Southern textile unionism was the way in which contracts were negotiated for the few limited number of plants where unions were established. Our customary process was to negotiate a contract in the North with the association in the North, Cotton Textile Association in the North, and then approach the Southern textile manufacturers in order to adopt similar terms. And of course they resisted, and negotiations would be very protracted. Finally, we would get one of the employers to agree to proceed toward negotiations, and we'd reach a contract. We always found the sequence thereafter was very, very intriguing.
simple idea about this power that the industry had, in that you all knew that that you weren't surprised. You understood that the industry.
Well, the industry, the managements of the cotton textile industry controlled, or substantially controlled, the political machines in the state. It controlled the organization of the political system of the towns in which they were located. They controlled, for the most part, the preachers and priests who were preaching in their local villages, and the newspapers which were published in their communities. And of course, that leaves nobody who had any significant influence on attitudes and publicity and public news in the textiles South.
That's so good, I want you to say it again and make it a little smoother, would you please? The textile industry of the South.
Yeah.
So,
The
textile- okay.
But
Yes, go ahead.
The textile manufacturers of the South were a closely knit, organized group sharing many opinions, many attitudes together. And they had a common attitude, is to use their power in order to enforce their views and to exclude or prevent the rise of unions. They had power on the state government, which meant the legislature and the governor, and where needed, they could get them to send in the National Guard, as they did in Georgia and the Carolinas and Alabama when strikes occurred. They would control the local government so that they could control the police and fire departments. So if you had they wanted to get a organizer out of town, they had true officials as their weapons and tools for executing that. They controlled the local church because they financed, in most part, many of the churches. They controlled the newspapers because, in many cases, they owned the newspapers. So you go on and relate to all the civic and public institutions in the southern area, as well as the economic agencies, the banks, and the other industries. They were all forced to conform to the employers, southern textile employers' dictates.
Now this power then extended itself because they controlled the textile code. They controlled this very legislation that was going to free up these textile workers, right?
Well, in the case of the NRA, they were legally empowered under the code to administer the code and refuse the government's request to place any labor people on the Textile Authority.
Now, could you talk about the role of women in the 34 strike?
Well, women's role was very central. They played a supportive role in all communities because the strike required mass meetings, feeding, aid to people in distress, and other human qualities. And the women always covered those forces. Many of them were picket line people. The union, women in unions are a very crucial force because they have a magnetism of their own, and therefore are able to to act more in unison, and also to do some of the unwelcome chores that come into a battle on this picket line.
Now, because the textile industry was at that time at least half the people in the mills, I believe, were women, did that make a difference?
Well, it is about 50% at that time.
Sorry, 50%.
Yeah, they vary from one
Could
period
you start
to
again saying they're 50% women at that time?
yeah, the they're
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. You see, I want you to say, at that time, about 50% of the employees were in textiles were women, and then go on from there. You have to say that first.
yeah, there were about 50% of the employees were women. It varied slightly from year to year. They were very, on the whole, you would find that women are very aggressive picketers, and make create a spirit of unison, which is most helpful in the course of a strike. So, and of course, they're bound together much more tightly than men do, and the result is that they're a much more significant force in the strike episodes.
Before we were at the table, you said that if you don't have the army on your side, you lose.
Oh.
Now, and you were talking about power, I think, in a specific sense and in a broad sense. So before you were saying, the textile industry had all this power locally, and then they had that power with this legislation, and that with the textile code, and that then the textile industry didn't want to recognize the unions, and that the only thing I imagine that was left for the workers was to use public pressure. And to try to pressure the government to pressure the industry. Could you speak to that and relate that to the strike?
Yes, that is unfolded in the course of the 34 strike. Every moment in the course of the strike, when the union was beginning to feel the resistance from political and other economic forces and local officials, the union always turned to the government, hoping that the government would provide them with relief from the strength and power of the employer's influence on the power groups within a community. So the union was in every crucial point always dependent on the government, and if the government didn't respond sympathetically, it was lost, because the only weapon the union had was to keep on striking, and the workers can't strike eternally. Sooner or later they will be forced to surrender by the sure inability to endure without income.
So the statement that you said, if you don't have the army on your side, you lose.
Well,
could you say that again and tell me what you mean?
Now, one of the real forces breaking strikes in the 30s, and in the textile industry particularly, was the militia. And as we know from all the cases that the militia was called out, rarely does the militia come out and support the demands of the union. They are generally called out to protect so-called property. And militia, National Guard were called out in many strikes, cotton textile strike, both in the South and the North. And in Georgia, they even had a concentration camp maintained by the militia of the state, in which they packed in every textile worker they arrested, and thereby greatly weakened the leadership for the strike. And when you turn to other communities, and in Rhode Island, we had fierce battles where the governor used the militia, and people were killed. I don't know how many people were killed in the 34 strike, but it must strikers. If my understanding is correct, and from the data I have read in the past, it well exceeds 25 workers who were killed, and about 5 or 7 militiamen who were killed during these strikes. But there's similar kinds of cases, let's say in Toledo, Ohio, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Pacific Coast. All of these strikes, people were killed by the militia that had been called out by governors to destroy and resist unions.
So at that time, what did you see as the missing link for the textile workers union? You know, at the end of that strike, what did they learn from it?
Well,
I mean, and just if you could speak from your perspective, having being working there at the time.
Yeah. Well, one of the major lessons any trade unionist learns is that you have to beware before you use your last resort, which is the strike, because this involves great sacrifice. Consequently, you're likely to, depending on the effect that you can have, depending on the individual circumstance, you're going to be very cautious as to how to call the strike and how long the strike endures. And therefore, you're going to be more inclined to an incremental improvement in conditions of employment rather than absolute gains of a major kind in a course of one dispute.
You wanted to ask about the convention?
Okay. Yeah, the convention and the decision to strike, the big decision, the culmination came at the national convention
In New York.
August of 1934.
No, in New York City.
Right, in New York City. Could you tell us about that?
Well, the order for a strike came at a convention in August of 1934 in New York City, and at which the delegates all unanimously voted for the strike. It's interesting, as I mentioned earlier, that early in this month of September or August, a strike began in Alabama. I think there were about 20 mills unionized there at the time, and they called a strike. So you see the spirit, the identification of the time indicated that workers will not realize their ends unless they go to the bitter end of going on strike. So the atmosphere in the country as a whole favored using this tool when you finally find the resistance impenetrable. And that was the decision of the convention in New York, which resulted in calling the strike.
Do you think that the workers ever had a chance? Did they believe that they had a chance with the NRA and the textile code
Well, the
particularly
workers
Southern
hoped,
workers.
the workers hoped that they would have a chance. But as history has told us, it was never realized, and it hasn't been realized to date. And that ultimately, while the current moods prevail in this country, there will be only one way to make progress towards unionization, is if the government sets up a compulsory system of workers' representation in mills.